Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'm Jessica Weiss, the director of the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs, or ACF, where we seek to add rigor and reason to the public and policy conversations about China. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome such an esteemed panel of both journalists and my fellow colleagues here at SAIS today to talk about some of the challenges of covering China from within. A second panel later this morning will talk about the challenge of covering China and its increasingly global presence. But for now, let me first introduce my fellow panelists. Directly to my right is Yuan, reporter for the New York Times and the host of a very well-known podcast, Conversations with Yuan, or the Booming By podcast. Next, we have Jodi Schneider, formerly with Bloomberg and currently the governor and press freedom chair at the Overseas Press Club. Welcome, Jodi. It's wonderful to be in partnership with you here today. Next, we have my colleague Chen, the William L. Clayton Chair and Associate Professor of Johns Hopkins University SAIS. And last but certainly not least, my colleague Andy Mertha, the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies, Director of the China Studies Program, and the Director of the SAIS China Global Research Center here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So as we gather here today, I think one of the biggest questions when you look at the current media and scholarly ecosystem covering China, I wanted to ask each of you in turn, what do you see as some of the biggest weaknesses? And in short, what are we consistently missing or getting wrong in today's environment? Lee, and why don't we start with you?
Hello? Okay. For me, I think the biggest weakness is there's too much focus on tech, trade, and geopolitics. Those are very important issues, of course, but I think we risk of framing everything through the lens of geopolitics. Like the United States, China is a very big, complex country, and we can't talk about China's tech and manufacturing power without taking into account the economy as a whole and the well-being of its people. That's what I see. I wrote about this in a column maybe in May about two Chinas. There's the hopeful China, what I call the hopeful China, the tech. The world of Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi, and Huawei. Those are really world-class companies. But there's also what I call the gloomy China, the weak consumption, the rising unemployment, and the housing crisis, on and on and on. It's like there's a crisis of confidence for general Chinese if you talk to them. And I just think if we want to tell a China story, we have to take into account of both of them. It's just like, when you talk about the United States, you cannot just talk about how powerful the Silicon Valley is. And then without talking about all the other issues this country has. And so that's what I think I would like to say. We talk about both sides and not just talk about, China is winning. The DeepSeek is so wonderful. Look at all the robots China have. Look at the high-speed railways, and all of those are true. But we have to look behind a lot of things behind that. So, and that's what I think. There's what I feel from my years of covering China. I see a tendency of swing from one side to the other, from ignoring, demonizing China to now I kind of feel like a glorifying China. So, it's from like underestimation to overestimation. I just feel like we need to find some kind of like a nuance or the middle ground. Like that's what I feel like we need to. We can give give the readers, give our audience a more truthful portrayal of China. I can keep talking about this because I have so much, so much I can vent about, like from my years of covering China, my frustration of reading all the stories. You know, I film almost every day. I was like, what? They know this? But at the same time, of course, there have been always like wonderful China coverage. I don't want to say like I'm not happy about most of them, but I really say at this moment, especially in the past 7-8 months since the DeepSeek moment, I saw a swing to the other side.
A way to get us started. Thank you. And hopefully we'll dive into some more of those questions in a bit. Jodi, what about you?
Thank you, and thank you for including me in this panel. I think from my perspective as a press freedom advocate and somebody who's cared about this my whole career, that the concern now is not just the concern we've had with China in terms of press freedom and state control of the media, but there are fewer and fewer journalists from outside who are being allowed to work in China. First of all, when you look at the numbers, the Press Freedom Index from Reporters Without Borders, China's 178 out of 180, only Eritrea and North Korea or worse. And we've also seen Hong Kong, where I was and many of us were, where it was there was a fair bit of press freedom. And as recently as 2019, before the protests, Hong Kong had scored in the 70s on that list. They are now much lower on that list. So there's that state control, and when we talk about state control of the media, we don't just mean the state, the media that is owned and run by the state, but they control obviously the visas of journalists going into China, and those have not been granted nearly as freely, and they were always tight. But in recent years, tighter and tighter, and journalists have gotten kicked out of the country. And China controls what journalists do when they are in the country. They are very surveilled, they're watched very closely who they talk to. And that is happening more and more in Hong Kong as well. It's hard to get people to talk to you. So journalists operating there and media publications operating both in China and in Hong Kong are really having to be really creative about ways just to do their work, to do their basic work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jodi. Ling, can I turn to you for the perspective of one scholar, and we'll hear also from Andy as well on this. What do you see as some of the biggest weaknesses in our coverage of China?
Thanks, and my pleasure to be here. So for me, from our scholar perspective, I think the biggest weakness is that we lack a on-the-ground perspective to understand why certain actors behave in certain way and what their intentions are. And as a result, we tend to rely too much on formal leaders' speech, formal documents to interpret the intentions and results, which affects both our work quality and the way in which we interact with each other. Some examples in my field are, let me try to think of examples. So, for example, all the success or increase in China's industrial manufacturing are typically interpreted as state subsidies to state-owned firms as a way to overtake United States. As opposed to, China is having this overcapacity because the real estate bubbles break and so, right? And there's more story behind that. Most of the private firms in China were seen as the tools for Chinese party state as opposed to real private firms. The recent study of over-centralization under the Xi Jinping government, because we have this lack of access problem, are overly relying on documents at the policy documents at the central and the local level, as documents as they printed out as text, rather than what exactly bureaucrats and businesses were doing on the ground. Hence, they cannot explain why in some places they're doing so well, they're actively developing AI, semiconductor, and extra, and in some other areas, they're simply paralyzed. because of that, we want to call for more, just echoing this panel, that we want to call for more nuanced understanding of China. And I believe that this is not only, but having a perspective from within is not only important to understand China from within, it's also important to understand China's foreign policy, because all the foreign policy has their domestic politics, have their domestic messages. I think I'll stop.
Really important set of points, Ling, thank you. We've all voiced a number of complaints here, and I want to also, open space for how have we overcome some of these challenges. And Andy, I know you've led a really important project on studying China in the absence of access. So what are some of the best practices that you've identified for, nonetheless trying to understand China, even given the hurdles that we've been talking?
So if I can, first of all, Jessica, thanks for inviting me to this panel, and I'd like to come back around to that if I could. But I wanted to, I wanted to add to this particular discussion as well. But I want to start by acknowledging the fact that long before on-the-ground scholarship in China, at least US scholarship, became a thing, what we learned most was from journalists. So, when I was first learning about China way back when, people whose work I read over and over again, people like Stanley Carnow, Bob Butterfield, Roger Garside. So there is I would just want to echo what Jim was saying. There's a real, there's real synergy of interests here. In talking about the problems, before I talk about or mention kind of what I'm trying to do in my neck of the woods, is I think there's first of all, there's an arm's length nature of research that is problematic for a number of reasons. Part of this, I think, is due to risk aversion. Some of it's reasonable, some of it less reasonable. I remember those of us who are in positions of some security, which is in the case of say tenured faculty, we were browbeaten by not browbeaten exactly, but by about not recognizing our position of responsibility, of taking the lead when other groups of folks within the academy are at some vulnerability. I remember when first time I went back to China after COVID, I remember sitting around with some colleagues who were living and working in Hong Kong, and they were taking bets on how many hours I'd be detained when I crossed the border. And so I built in an extra 5 hours just in case, and so I ended up sitting at the Shenzhen airport for 5 extra hours because nothing happened. So there is this risk aversion there. The other thing I think, and Ling touched upon this with documents, is that we're getting increasingly reliant on more easily available data. And as a result, it biases and distorts what we know by us really not being able to go into what we don't know. And so that's something, I mean, it's been a perennial problem, but it's just gotten worse. So I think at this point, it's still a difference of degree, not in kind, but I think we're not too far away from that happening. Third thing is that I think for those of us in academia, there is a shift more towards, especially for younger colleagues, a shift towards the intellectual center of our disciplines, which do not necessarily reward in-country expertise. And so that becomes a kind of a vicious circle. And then I wanted to come back and just agree wholeheartedly with Yuan's point about being more than one China. I think the focus on China, and this is a through line for I think a lot of what I'm going to say today, is that we focus on China as a unitary state, which technically it is. But in doing so, we ignore the vast majority of what's going on in China, and frankly, the vast majority of things that keep Xi Jinping awake at night. We think about things in geopolitics, in international terms. We do not think about it in terms of China as an extraordinarily complex state. One of the things, and Jessica very kindly mentioned, one of the things that I've been trying to do with scholars, all of us are doing our little bit to try to mitigate these problems. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is how do we how do we make the most out of such a challenging situation that we find ourselves in? And so one of the things that I've been looking at with other scholars is kind of bringing in people who studied China in the late 60s, 70s, the so-called Pekingologists, to help train those of us who didn't need Pekingology because we took access to China for granted. And so that might help mitigate some of the things that Ling was talking about, not only in terms of just having the documents, but how to actually make sense of them and go through them and read between the lines and make sense of the repetition of silences, Simon Lee's put it. I'm currently working on a second version of that, which is studying China from outside of China. And that's what a lot of people are doing today. There's lots of other ways of approaching this. But I think one of the things that we really, that these questions raise is, okay, so given the situation, how do we actually study China given the hand we've been dealt?
Sandy, and I wanted to pull out a couple of threads here about what we don't know. And we've talked about some of the challenges of knowing, but I want to put a finer point on what are some of the things where you think that we are perhaps collectively kind of overly confident in some of our assertions that might actually require a bit more humility as one of the values that underpins the work that we do here at ACF, not only rigor, but also humility, knowing the limits of what we know so that we and others can go forth and try to understand it better. I don't know if Jodi, you or Lee want to speak a little bit to that question of, what do we not know if we don't go to China? If we can't be on the ground, what are the things where we should be a little cautious in drawing some conclusions?
Well, I think this speaks to the need to have more people on the ground in China, more journalists, more academics, as well as more Chinese academics and journalists in the US, which is going to be a problem here if this proposal from the Department of Homeland Security goes through, which would limit foreign journalists on I visas to 8 months without a necessary automatic renewal. So this is a problem on this side, getting Chinese journalists here, because of course the best journalism is done when you are, and we found this, our OPC awards winners go to these places. They get sources there. They see things that you're not going to see. And in China, this is particularly important because of course the government wants to control what you see. You go on a so-called junket that they've rearranged or they've arranged, it's not going to tell you what you need to know. So I think that's what we don't know is going to be greater if we're not there. It's that simple. And both the same for Chinese journalists reporting on the US, trying to report fairly on the US. Thank you.
Recently, a young Chinese told me something I thought that was really poetic. And she said, China is a country that looks really good from drones. From drones, and then you look down because they are like the highways, the bridges, China just built the world's tallest, highest bridge in Guizhou. I saw a lot of US media cover that. It's a great picture, great image. And then, also the skyscrapers, the high-speed trains, and all those things, it's really looks amazing. For me personally, last time I was in China was the Chinese New Year of 2020. And we all know that Wuhan was locked down. Then I rushed back to Hong Kong. And then I was kicked out of Hong Kong in 2021, and I haven't been back to China. I've been covering China from outside China. And so I'm always worried I will lose the real touch, the real feelings of China. I worry about it all the time. The smell, the taste, the vibe, it's very hard to get that when you are covering something from afar. I remember in 2021, I wrote a column about the rise of Chinese domestic brands that were competing with multinational brands like Starbucks, like P&G or whatever, like Nike. Then there was one ice cream brand, 钟雪糕. People like young people they really loved it. They talk about it all the time. I just couldn't get hold of that ice cream. I couldn't taste it. I just didn't know it was really good. It was just like a vibe, right? A hype. And so that was something you could never tell. Of course, now I'm sure if I look really hard, I might be able to find something here in the US, but it was during the pandemic. So I also missed the dinner discussions in Beijing and Hong Kong, and visiting places in China. For example, I asked my friends when they were going to visit Xiong'an, if you know that city. It's a pet project of Xi Jinping, basically a city built on Xi Jinping's vision. When my friends, I heard some friends were going there, asked them to videotape, take a lot of photos and videotape, and then just kind of, I wanted to get some feel of it. There are a lot of frustrations about that. So it's also, to echo Jodi's points, it's I'm really worried about we don't have enough people on the ground in China, and we do have journalists. While we do have journalists in China, they are surveilled, they are threatened constantly, and it is also hard for them to go out to write, to cover China, and the Chinese people are intimidated all the time, and also by the authorities, and it's almost like a crime speaking to the foreign media, because you're like DDoS, you hand over the bad materials to hostile foreign media. That's what the Fang Fang episode during the Wuhan lockdown came from. It's like, you should not talk bad about China, otherwise you're hurting your motherland, and then you're helping the house of. Anyway, it's just very difficult for journalists like me who are covering China from afar, but it's also very difficult for journalists inside China to cover China. So there are a lot of challenges.
Can I ask a follow-up, which is that, with shrinking bureaus and staffing inside China, how have outlets like Bloomberg and the New York Times been rethinking their China coverage? What do you see as some of the implications of this shift for the types of stories that are chosen, sourcing and verification? Would either of you like to comment?
To be honest, I'm not, I'm a columnist. I work from home almost all the time. I don't really, I stay up around midnight every day. So I don't really I don't even go to the New York office, our headquarters. We have two correspondents in China, Vivian Wang and Case Bradshaw, and it's such huge country for the two of them just to travel to places. Case covered a lot about trade, geopolitics, and Vivian, I just love Vivian Wang's stories. If you have time, I highly recommend you read her stories, about this guy who in Guizhou, in rural Guizhou, I believe it was Guizhou, and who refused, who did not want his house to be torn down by the government. Then he just kept building up and built like a nine-floor building. It was like crazy story. It's a really show like the spirit of Chinese people. And also she just wrote another story the other day about the last mile of food delivery. How do you deliver food to 70th floor in Shenzhen? And when the elevator wait is like 30 minutes. And so it was like, so great. I love Vivian's coverage. And those are like, of course, when we had 8 correspondents in China before 2020, so many of us could go out and write stories. Some of us covered more arts, demographics, I covered tech. They're like just, you have more spectrum to write about things. Now it's like, I feel like the two of them, they work so hard. They have to cover from so many aspects. And this is such huge country, 1.4 billion people. How it's just, I just hope, to echo Jodi's point, I think we need more business.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the New York Times and Bloomberg and Reuters and the European publications who do have bureaus and presence in China are doing what they can. I think that their standards are being upheld. Their independent journalist standards, they work very hard on accuracy and fairness and an independent voice. I don't think they say, okay, we have to lower our standards. I haven't seen any of that in the coverage. I think they're doing what they can, but it's hard. I mean, the New York Times is covering, China and Hong Kong from Seoul now. That's where the bureau is. And I think that, a lot of publications have moved people to Singapore from Hong Kong. So it makes it harder. I do think, in a bright spot, if you will, there is more independent journalism of China through places like Substack. Bill Bishop's Sinoism is one of the most popular, most read things, most subscribed things to on Substack. You are seeing that. You are seeing some independent publications against all odds crop up, somewhat in the mainland, but in Hong Kong, where many have been closed down. Others are popping up. So I do think there is a spirit there to try to cover as much as journalists can, but again, it's tough. And for instance, economic data, a lot of publications, and I know Bloomberg and Reuters, have run their own data, and in some cases, to verify, to try to be as accurate as they can about the economic picture in China, not just relying on what the state is telling them. Thank you.
Thanks, that's great. Turning to the scholarly perspective, I know that the space for journals has become very constricted, and there are certainly concerns and challenges on the expert side as well. But both of you, Andy and Ling, spoke about the importance of field work. And so I'm, even if you didn't get stopped at the border, nonetheless, how has the experience of doing field work changed over the last decade or so? If you were making the case that we should continue to still do it, what could you, to put a fine point on it, what is the value of doing this kind of on-the-ground research, and what specific insights do you think in your own research you couldn't have gotten any other way?
Sure, if I can, thank you. So losing access or having constricted access, means a lot of things, at least for me and the people that I'm working with and training and so on. So I think the first thing is that we lose kind of the gray areas of data collection. One of the things, like in China, if you do everything the way you're supposed to do it, nothing ever gets done. So everything is always a little bit of a just a kind of massaging of opportunities and finding ways to be lucky. But these kinds of happy accidents don't happen if you're not there. So one of the articles that I'm most proud of on centralization in China, that came just somebody, it was actually interviewing somebody from Nike in Shanghai, and he mentioned that. And that, just kind of threw it out there, like, of course you know about this, right? And of course I didn't know about this. And it became a research agenda just by virtue of being, having this kind of a happy accident. For people who do archival stuff, the digitalization of everything means that you can't find that misplaced kind of document or set of documents in the stacks that eventually, that ultimately, give you much more information than anything else. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is, the increasing anxiety about harming interlocutors in China. Sheena Greitens and Rory Truex wrote a piece, it was published in the China Quarterly in 2020 called Repressive Experiences Among China Scholars. And one of the big findings there is that on the one hand, scholars do not generally self-censor, but when they do so not out of fear of not getting future access, but rather because they're afraid of compromising the people who provide them with the data. So that's really, really important. And as I mentioned before, a lot of this kind of falls on the shoulder of, or a lot of the people who are victimized by this are junior scholars. I wanted to also kind of, Yuan has been really, really good at articulating things better than I might have. But what I would like to do is just kind of riff on one of the things that she was saying about vibes, about smells, tastes, things like that. This is really, really important to just get a feel for the place, not only to help test your own research, but also for pedagogical reasons. Particularly, and you might get this later, with students increasingly feel uncomfortable about actually going to China. It means it puts more of a burden, which I'm happy to take on, to bring more of everyday China into the classroom. Leo had mentioned vibes. I think vibes are really, really important, but I think another way of thinking about those is as instincts. My students have heard me say this a zillion times, but at the best moments, you might have 20 or 30% of the data that you need. And so you have to make inferences. You have to close these gaps of knowledge. And the best resource you have are your instincts. And those instincts are based on what you're constantly taking in from spending time on the ground in China. And we lose that. And sometimes we not even know what's going on. I'll just give one example. I remember I returned from my honeymoon in Thailand. My new wife and I were going through Guangdong, and we saw all of these photos of Deng Xiaoping just everywhere. And we were wondering, well, what's going on? Of course, that was February of 1992. And I was based in Shanghai at the time, and I could feel a palpable, almost tangible change week by week as we moved from February 1992 to October of 1992 to the 14th Party Congress. And essentially with Deng Xiaoping's reform agenda being put back on track. And you could sense the excitement bubbling just below the surface. Cautious excitement, but nonetheless, you had it was a very, very different feel from a year before that. And unless you were on the ground in China, first of all, you didn't know if it was happening in real time, even if you didn't know what it was. But the other thing is that you can really speak about the importance of politics at the at street level by experiencing that yourself. So we lose all of that.
Ling, did you want to add anything?
Let me just add a couple of points from my personal perspective as a researcher and how I see the broader field. When I was doing research for my first book project, and in general, I started going to China field a lot more, starting 2008, and broadly speaking, 2010, 2011-ish, I was able to access a lot of and conduct a lot of interviews, hundreds of them. And at the time, the picture was so different that I would go to banquets with local bureaucrats and drink with them, get their perspective. And this is partly how you formulate your hypothesis for your theory, not necessarily in a formal one-on-one interview, but that affects your perspective, your insights. And also I could interview a lot of enterprises such as Huawei, such as ZTE. At the time, most people have not heard of them yet. So they, it's like I took for granted these opportunities to conduct interviews. But starting in 2015-ish, I started to experience difficulties that whenever I go to the field, for example, trying to interview about technology innovation of enterprises, certain development of enterprise, or how local governments help them, the access was not great, and I was, without naming names, I was referred to some of the PDF documents on their official website. They said, well, what we're gonna tell you, well, exactly verbatim repeating of like, I would just read from this PDF document, maybe you can just go to download by yourself, right? So that is a big change compared to before that period. Of course, increasingly we come to a time that if you want to interview Huawei, well, everyone has heard of Huawei by now, right? So that becomes, when an enterprise raises up to that level and there are certain sensitivities involved, it's very hard to get access. So there is a general broader field, general broader trend in our field for our pipeline scholars that this lack of access problem is causing them to focus more on survey experiments or online surveys, public opinions, topics related to public opinions, instead of, for example, examining what's the actual impacts of trade war, right? They're examining what are the public opinions about trade war. There is general trend because of lack of access to interview to focus more on observational quantitative studies, survey experiments, machine learning, and or things that happened decades ago. Because things happened decades ago, you have more well-developed secondary resources instead of contemporary period where you still have to develop the first-hand experience. So that affects both our methods and the topic as well. Now, one thing I noticed, which originally could be a good trend, is in the pipeline, China experts are more and more scholars that are from mainland China. That is, more and more they are Chinese students coming to the States and get their PhDs and eventually become professors. But the most unfortunate thing I think is, well, originally they were equipped with the language tools and everything to access China, but because of the this limitation and constraint, also because of the trend of our own discipline, right? As Andy mentioned, we're not seeing a lot of this kind of works. That is one of the things that is really one of the things that we could have done better that we have not. I would just stop here. I think Andy has.
Thanks. I just had a two-finger on, Ling raised a number of excellent points as usual. But I wanted to, she reminded me of one that I hadn't thought of, but that I think is also really, really important in answering this question. And that is, when you've got a student who is on the eve of going into the field and doing their research, they write a prospectus, the committee signs off on it, and it's basically a contract between the student and their committee that they're going to do X, Y, and Z. And the expectation among the committee is that there's probably going to be a huge, or at least a palpable change in what they actually end up doing. Because usually when you get into the field, you realize you're asking the wrong questions, or you're looking at things the wrong way, or you haven't taken into account something that's actually driving what you're looking at. When I was in the field, my causal arrows reversed themselves. So the problem here, of course, is that if you're taking that component out of that fieldwork component out of serious research, you're far more likely to come up with something that is inaccurate and something that's based on existing priors or biases or expectations. And so in a sense, we're I don't want to come off too strongly, but we end up kind of deluding ourselves as to what is actually going on there.
That's such an important point, Andy, that we find what we're looking for unless you're sometimes confronted with, oh, things aren't actually quite the way you thought. It's much harder to revise one's intuitions. And I think this is true about using documents and speeches too. From my experience, even this past summer going to China, oftentimes it's really, I found it very helpful to understand how folks inside China were interpreting the same data or speeches that we can have access to, because it colors what you take away from from those same documents. Okay, so we have time for, I think, a last round before we turn to your questions from the audience. So for each of you, if you could recommend one change in either institutional policies or in newsroom priorities or in scholarly training that would most improve the global conversation about China, what would it be? First, anybody want to start? Otherwise, we can go down the line. Lee, would you like to begin?
I think Ling touch upon this already. You know, I hope media organization could hire more Chinese China-born reporters to cover China. It's because I'm from that background. It's just very important to be able to read, to interact with source material, with people. It's just more natural, especially in this period that Chinese people are so scared of speaking to journalists, and it's just like one less barrier it's I don't know how people are going to interpret how I say this, but it just make people at ease, more easier to make people at ease, and also it's the background. You know, even for me, like my generation and like the younger generation of Chinese, like the knowledge of where China came from is already, you know, I found like many young Chinese, they don't really know what they don't remember what happened in China at that time, even like 10, 15 years ago, when I was covering China tech. And what happened then, it's like, I have to remind them, like when I have conversations with them, I have to remind them, this has happened before. And this had, you know, this is where things, it's quite difficult for Chinese who grew up in that environment to remember, to understand everything. It's just like, I think language is very, very important. It's to be able to read all the documents. I'm not saying like, you know, people like Jessica and it's like there are many people who speak like perfect Chinese who can do it, but I just think we need more China-born journalists to cover China. Of course, there are a lot of barriers. It's like intimidation from the government, you know, like you have family members there and all those things. It's very tough, but I really see news organizations benefiting from that.
I would like to say to both the US and China's governments to let the journalists in. Do not use visas as a weapon against journalism, against getting to know these countries, getting to report on them. I think that in the long run, even though they are worried about their image and how they'll be portrayed, I think in the long run it does the government's good as well to have accurate, fair, balanced journalism out there from both sides. So we as the OPC and other journalism organizations have very much come out against this visa proposal, and the Chinese government actually has come out against it as well. They don't, they in the back and forth with the U.S. government over visas. But I think just letting journalists into these countries, looking at their visas the way they used to, obviously appropriately evaluating their ability, and their news organizations backing of them, but let them in. Thank you.
Well, I have one relatively limited change proposed because I think in the short run, large scale of scholarly exchange between US and China may be difficult. But one limited change I want to propose is to require or recommend students read news and articles published in both US and China and compare the reports on the same matter. There are plenty of examples of how do we understand China's parade from abroad and from domestically? How do we understand that China's T visa and what we just opened up a T visa, right? So all these things, on the same matter, it's important to compare the foreign and domestic perspective. And some people may say, well, this required language training to understand Chinese. If learning Chinese is not plausible in the short term for some of the students, they can simply rely on AI translation, right? AI gets better and better nowadays anyway. So I think even though the translation would not be exactly accurate, it still helps with the matter. And I think this change is doable.
Thank you. I guess if there was just one thing, it would be a pretty big thing. It's a kind of a normative change. But I think we need to embrace the notion that we're always better off with more knowledge than with less. And that's whether we see China as a misunderstood ally or as a direct existential threat. In either case, in knowledge generation, I think we should consider mitigating risk ex post more than on the overwhelming tendency to do it ex ante. When it comes to scholars, journalists, and others who genuinely engage with China in these times, I think what we should do is verify or trust. That would be my suggestion.
Fantastic. Thank you all for those opening remarks. Now we'll turn to the audience for your questions. Please, if you can, there's a microphone, yes, in the middle, or no, passing mics. Okay. So here I saw firsthand. User, would you please briefly identify yourself? Yes, briefly identify yourself. And then direct your question to whoever you like.
Thank you. So my name is Jordan Lee, fourth year PhD at SAIS, and someone who take pride of doing fieldwork in China. So I have two questions. First one is, how do you address the lack of institutional support for both academia and I guess journalists as well from the American side, and the lack of commitment to send students or researchers or journalists to China? And second is one question that I was confronted when demonstrating my research to people more in the policy world about local China or more grassroots China. Their first reaction is, why do we care? So how do we address this question of generating knowledge about, let's say, government policy making at a rural Chinese town to the greater audience and tell them it is really important? Thank you.
Take that.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Let me address your second question, which is, I think, very challenging question. Because nowadays, the focus on China, to the extent that you're doing research, is the general audience interest is less and less on what happened in this Chinese village. How do I understand the normal people's life in this rural China village? It's more about, to the extent matter, how does it matter for my taste or for the US audience interest? And again, that a lot of folks are on the, what Lee has mentioned, the geopolitical geopolitical reasoning or geopolitical content. So I acknowledge that I do not have perfect solution about on the question you raised, but perhaps when you are doing a research, let's see, in this China village or China locality, what important is like what are the theoretical implications that you can derive from that? And that may be from a very small town or village, probably there can generate a bigger theoretical implication and message that you then you can talk to the broader audience and to make them interested. I don't know if this helps at all.
Thanks, Ling. So just on the lack of institutional support on the US side, I mean, what I would say is that things are so much in churn right now that it's very difficult. We haven't reached a point where we can kind of take stock and see where we are and what we can do, and how we can kind of map up to the Chinese side. There's all sorts of kind of long-standing institutional challenges, but right now we're really in the epicenter of something that is unprecedented, and it unfortunately the timing couldn't be worse for students who want to do research in on the field in the field in China. So I mean, my generic answer to that would be to kind of stay within the bounds of what we are required to do, but to be innovative and entrepreneurial kind of within those bounds. To answer the second question, I'll take a different tack from what Ling just did, and think about. I can just think of an example that I think could kind of push back on that "why should I care" question. So China and Ghana in the mid-aughts came to diplomatic blows following riots where people were killed in Ghana. This resulted from the fact that one county in China, in Guangxi province or the Guangxi Zhuang autonomous region, started sending its people to Ghana to undertake what was called galamsey, which is kind of the illegal mining for gold, using things like mercury and kind of undercutting the local Ghanaian gold economy. This is something that was not one of Beijing's foreign policy initiatives. It was something that was generated at the county level. And nonetheless, it put Beijing's relations with Ghana onto a really kind of relatively insecure footing. So domestic politics in China increasingly matter. And I think that's another thing that we should, as a China comparativist, I look at domestic politics, and so, international relations have largely been kind of off limits for me. As China extends internationally, and as it has under Xi Jinping, all of a sudden the pathologies that we've learned about Chinese domestic politics also get exported abroad. And therefore, it's really important for us, particularly in this time, I think, to understand what's going on domestically.
Great, thanks so much. We have another question, way in the back, the lady here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Laurel Schwartz. I was recently a school principal at a Canadian Chinese school in Beijing. And now that Yuan mentioned, the challenge of not being in China on the ground, and I can't imagine what it's like to not be able to go to your own home. But in addition to Bill Bishop and Vivian Wong and Keith Bradshaw, who do you follow to find out what's going on, either in English or in Chinese? What recommendations can you give us?
You can follow my podcast. Yeah, I do this Chinese podcast. It's approved by. It's my personal project, approved by the New York Times. I talk to mostly Chinese people on a weekly basis, and we chat about basically everything. It's in Chinese, but we also have transcripts for every episode. And as Ling mentioned, I found Google Translate is pretty good. And I most of the time I read Chinese sources. To be honest, I spend a lot of time on Chinese social media, which is not very healthy. But you have to, right? As a journalist, that's that's part of the job. I read Xiaohongshu, the Red Note, Weibo, WeChat, and it's Bilibili. I just do a lot of things, and I also I think Substack has become pretty good. There are, if you are talking about English sources, Bill Bishop, that's very good, and also I can't remember the name, Signification. They basically write about what's in people's daily every day, right? It's there are also some Chinese, young Chinese. They are very good. I just talked to this young writer, April Wang, who used to work in Silicon Valley, and now she writes about technology. basically full time, and it's called, her newsletter is called Concurrent on Substack, and it's like she went to China and then talked to Chinese AI developers, and she just wrote very long pieces with some kind of like a point of view from Silicon Valley. And it's very relatable for American audience. And I can't remember all the names. There's also another newsletter, young Chinese writer who writes about Chinese pop culture. I thought it's really amazing. You know, there are so many young Chinese, they are not like a trained journalists, but they are just very interested in sharing their perspectives. And I thought, yeah, I like those.
Thank you. We have here in the front, sir.
Thank you. My name is Irv Chapman. I'm a longtime member of the Overseas Press Club. And Yuan reminded me of my own analogous experience in the old Soviet Union, where journalists were under severe pressure, but also the regime lied through the teeth day in and day out. So I'd like to ask, to what extent we know what the Chinese regime did with regard to information about the COVID pandemic when it started. To what extent can you rely at all, if at all, on the official statements and statistics of the Chinese government? And to what extent are they outright lies? Oh, and point of order, would you please put the microphone as close as a rock star, because you're also politely soft-spoken.
I'd like to just address Irv's question from one perspective, and I'm sure others will have others, is that the data is, it's an issue. And this is partly why journalists in this country have stood up for the government continuing to allow things like independent data on jobs reports, for instance. And I know news organizations, including Bloomberg, including the New York Times, including Reuters, run models on economic data based on not only the data they are getting, but doing their own reporting as well. So it is an issue. It's certainly an issue.
Andy?
I just want to say one thing. One of the interesting things about Xi Jinping in particular is that if you look back on his particularly his kind of available speeches, if you go down to like the third or fourth paragraph, you know, he pretty much announces kind of what's going to happen. I think we also have to expand our imagination to imagine kind of what he's likely to do, and how that, you know, how it differs from, you know, what's come immediately ahead of him. So I don't tend to trust official statistics, or, you know, I'm not a Pekingologist. So, you know, I'm maybe speaking a little bit out of school here, but one of the things that she has done, if you could get through all that rhetoric, is kind of announce things fairly accurately, ex ante.
Way in the back, I see somebody.
Yes, hello, my name is Prab. So I'm curious to ask you, one of the things that Mrs. Chen described was on the ground. So I'm wondering, considering the technology we have over 8,000 satellites, you know, and we can use a lot. China has, I think, about 3,000 something. So why not discuss about using other forms of technologies, GIS maps, or satellites, to actually find ways, innovative ways to see what's going on, what's the news out there. Why not discuss something on the AI level as well? Why just on the ground? Like, why not other ways? Because we are going to a new phase of world. I would like to hear a perspective on that.
Thank you. And let's take a couple of different questions, because we are nearing the end of the session. So up here in the front, you've been so patient as we wait for the mic to come up.
Chris McRae. I'm a statistician, but my father worked at The Economist for 40 years. My father taught me that you're going to go and do a global survey in someone else's country, what's best is to find someone who's trusted already inside that country and to follow their leads and to be positive about the things you're trying to research. So I was in Beijing 3 times between 2015 and 2019. Romano Prodi helped me once. It helped you because he still consults, I think, for Nanjing. Ying Lowry, who was Alibaba's biographer, was there at Tsinghua University, also the sportsman scholars. So if you find someone who's trusted and follow their leads, I think it is still possible to actually, find out what's working on the ground and if it really is working. And that's what interests me with engineering or health, improving it by finding out something that someone's talking about, but then going and seeing if it's really replicating in communities.
So, any last questions before we turn it to the panel? Yes. In the white.
Hi, so my name is Kaya, and I am a research assistant with a professor who's doing research on Chinese infrastructure in Africa. And we're also designing like a field trip to China to study Chinese infrastructure next summer. And I just want to ask if we got this opportunity and what advice you would give to educators and students during the field trip like experience, like what kind of things should they pay attention to and focus on so that they can get a better understanding of what's really going on in like China's political economy and society and culture. Thank you.
One last question here, and then we'll give each of you a minute.
Hi, I'm Pete Kobus. I'm a former, technically current global affairs editor with Voice of America, former Moscow bureau chief. 2 quick questions. I don't know that I've ever trusted USAGM's numbers on our audience size in China, but I'm wondering if since VOA has been shut down, if its absence has been felt on the ground. I'm also editing a memoir for an ethnic Uyghur who's based here in the Washington area. He has this argument that, totally different topic here, that the Taiwan Straits issue is all a smokescreen to distract international attention from repression of the Uyghurs. And I'm wondering if there's, any veracity to that theory. Thank you.
All right, so we have a range of questions. You all have a minute each to say whatever you'd like, either to address the questions or a key takeaway you'd like to leave the audience with.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about the satellite. It's satellite images and AI, New York Times and also many other news organizations have been using satellite images. Remember, there was, I can't remember the news organization, there was a Pulitzer Prize for satellite, based on satellite images of the Uyghur concentration camps, and that was amazing work. And also at the times we have the visual investigation team, and they do a lot of visual investigations. But the problem with, we cannot just report on China based on images from high up, like thousands of miles away, right? And I talk about like China is a country that looks really good from drones, right? Behind all the high-speed railways, there's a lot of deaths, overcapacity, it's like a lot of things. And also how whether people, ordinary Chinese, are benefiting from this, and what are the lessons we can learn there. It's just, it's not something, we need those stories, we need those coverages, but that coverage alone cannot be all. And also just one sentence about the VOA, the absence of VOA. I wrote about that, and I did 3 episodes about VOA being shut down and how it impacts Chinese. And I interviewed people from 70s to 20s, and it's the impact of VOA on generations of Chinese, and I feel that it's really, really a big loss. for the Chinese community inside China and outside China, and we need institutional news outlets to cover China, and yeah, that's what I'm.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that about VOA and the loss, losing those voices, and that there were voices, I think has been, I think we're only going to know how much in coming months and years, but it's a huge loss. Secondly, on satellites and AI, good question, but again, they are tools. And as journalists, they are tools. They will not replace journalists, and we will use them as tools, but I think that, again, getting journalists on the ground, getting journalists who know and can source, and also getting sources to talk to us again. They're not going to talk to the robots. They're not going to talk to the satellites. Thank you.
Okay, let me first briefly reply to the AI satellite question and start on, let me try to be positive first, that we have invented a lot of machine learning, amazing machine learning tools that can read tens of thousands of millions of documents much faster than human beings. We also have the GIS AI satellite technology that can draw amazing maps to see how things distributed. But still, the human side, why human side is important is because, for example, right now, China is opening up for K visa. You cannot understand why Chinese citizens are rejecting this idea. It seems to be a really good idea, right? Why Chinese citizens are rejecting this idea? If you try to answer this question through satellite, you cannot do that. And plus, because of data security has become so important in China recently, the access to satellite is limited to whenever you get to actually look at a map, you're like, why this ground, this particular place is blocked out? It's because that's very important areas that you cannot reach by your or those maps and satellite technology. And also to stop on a more positive ground, I think the question about what do we do for our field, what topic we study for field work, it is not as gloomy as we thought, because as Andy mentioned, that the global footprint has reached a lot, every corner of China almost. Perhaps you can always find an interesting topic that's always connecting the local with the global, and I would have a hard time to think somewhere of a locality in China that is absolutely out of touch with the global context nowadays. So yeah, I'll stop here.
That's a great primer for the next panel, but before we take our break, Andy, last thought.
So for my 1 minute, I can't speak about what the closure of VOA has done in China. What I can say is offer my immense gratitude, because when I was in China during Tiananmen in Chengdu, it was due to VOA that I knew what was going on. So it's a very, very important resource. Regarding the Uyghur, linking the Uyghur and the Taiwan issue, I think it sounds to me like one way of interpreting that is that there might be an attachment of too much intentionality to linking the two. I think very often when we look at what happens in China, and this is the Chinese, when they look at what happens in the US, they've been doing this for a very long time, is that we attach intentionality to things that are either coincidental or otherwise kind of fall together. I think we have to, it would help us to at least think about if such an activity was unintentional, how and why did it happen? I'm not going to add to anything that's already been said about the satellites and GIS, but it does seem to me to be a little bit more useful in scholarship than in journalism, for the reasons already stated. And then finally, in terms of what to do in the field, I would get off of any social media. I put your phone away, except to take photographs. And what I would do is, because of your jet lag, you're going to get up very early in the morning, go out on the street and just walk around. Take in as much as you can. Be a sponge. You might not even know what it is that you're taking in, but you will once you get back.
Please join me in thanking our first panel.